people tend to think about nutrition in sort of these silos. We talk about macronutrients a lot, like protein, carbs, fat. And the cool thing about plant foods is that they're usually blends of two or sometimes three. And that can make vegetarian nutrition maybe feel a little bit tricky or confusing. For instance, like beans. Well, beans contain protein and they also contain carbohydrates. Whole grains, we tend to think of a carbohydrate source, but they also contain protein. A cup of pasta contains 8 grams of protein, which would be more than an egg. Nuts, seeds, these contain protein, but they also contain a lot of fat. And so I think sometimes when we're so used to sort of thinking about, like chicken as a protein source, it can be kind of confusing then when we look at the plate and try to figure out where some of these vegetarian foods fit in.
Sports Nutrition for Teens, where we talk all things food, sports, and nutrition for peak athletic performance. I'm your host, Liz, a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and youth sports mom. This podcast is for teenage athletes because teenagers are unique. You are still growing, developing, and you're pushing yourself to your absolute limit, both physically and mentally training and competing in your sport. Join me as we talk with expert sports dietitians from around the world who work with the biggest and best athletes. Together, we will simplify nutrition so that you can apply it to your busy, sporty teenage life. We'll learn how you can eat in order to take your game to the next level. This is not your mama's podcast, but she is welcome to join us. Stay tuned to find out how to eat well, feel good, and look great to be the best athlete that you can be.
This is my time. This is my time.
Teens, today I am so excited to be joined by Alexandra Casparro. She is a registered dietitian. She has experience working with Division I athletes and is a very well-known dietitian in the plant-based community. And today we're going to talk about vegetarian athletes. So welcome, Alexandra. Can you tell our audience a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I am a dietitian, so I currently work over at Plant-Based Juniors. We help families who really want to get more plants on the plate. That's sort of where we say we help families. And then before that, I was a D1 dietitian for the University of the Pacific out in California. I have a master's degree in exercise physiology, and I sort of use that combination when I worked in sports nutrition.
And we're really excited to talk today because a lot of teenagers are starting to choose a more plant-based diet and staying very active. And one of the things we want to discuss today is that healthy? And if it is, how do we do it? So I'm really excited to dive in today. We're going to bust some myths about vegetarian diets and sports, share some really simple, realistic nutrition strategies, and help these teen athletes to feel strong, energized, and recovered as vegetarians. So let's start by defining what exactly are we talking about? Because there are a lot of different thoughts when someone hears vegetarian. So what is a vegetarian diet?
I mean, for the most exact definition would be a diet that includes plant foods, right? So everything that sort of falls in a plant-based diet, along with the inclusion of dairy and eggs. A vegan diet then would be no animal products, no animal-derived products, and just a diet that is fully from plant-based foods.
Okay, so the vegans are not even going to eat the things that come from animals like milk and eggs.
Yes. And I kind of, like to explain, I think there's a really big sort of plant-based, if you will, umbrella. We sort of fall under that personally. I know a lot of people, they'll say things like, oh, I'm plant-based, but I eat whatever. And, we sort of say, or I say a lot, we all need to be eating more plants. I mean, whether it comes to health benefits, when it comes to just, environment and the resources that it takes to raise animals, the more that we can choose to add more plants to our plate is a really good thing, whether that's 100%, 80%, there's some details there, but I think that in general, it's a good recommendation for everyone, including vegetarians and vegetarian athletes, just to sort of consider eating more whole plant foods.
Yeah, and sometimes there's a lot of feeling of pressure to have a label of a name.
Yeah.
But is that always necessary?
I don't think it It is. I like to, even though my company is called Plant-Based Juniors, which would be, definitely a label in that, I do try to get away from labels when I'm working with clients just because I don't think it's necessary. I think sometimes putting on specific guardrails can feel limiting. As part of my work as a sports dietitian, I worked a lot with eating disorder, especially eating disorder athletes. And sometimes I think labels can feel really limiting. So, vegetarian, the nice thing about labels is they do help us when it comes to figuring out, especially if it's for ethics, what's acceptable and what's not, and really helping others in that, especially when it comes to talking with parents or peers or coaches. But for a lot of people, if they're just trying to eat quote unquote more plants, then I think sometimes labels can be just not necessary because they don't need to be there.
That brings up a great point. What are some of the reasons that people follow a vegetarian diet? Because I can think of a lot of different people we're talking to today.
That's right. And there's no, wrong or right answer. I think a lot of people tend to follow a vegetarian diet. A lot of times it can just be as simple as they feel better, or maybe they don't even like meat. I've had a lot of clients over the years who will say things like, it's not even that I don't want to, it's just that I truly don't like the taste of meat. Okay, great. There are definitely health benefits when it comes to reducing meat intake. So that can be a reason. Ethics. So whether that's, relating to environment, a lot of, vegetarian teens especially sort of come into it from more of an activist point of view when it comes to animal welfare. So I think there's a lot of reasons of why someone wants to eat this way.
Yeah, and some have a religious reason.
That's right.
As well. I think that's another aspect to consider. And the cultural aspects, some cultures are just more of a vegetarian based culture, and some of their foods, I hope today we can reach all of you listening in this vegetarian category, because there's a real variety of people who are going to fall into this. It's not just one person looks like one thing. Food has to look one way. So this kind of brings us back to this point you brought up earlier. I mean, is it safe to be a vegetarian?
I mean, spoiler alert, yes, it is safe to be a vegetarian. It's safe to be a vegetarian athlete. It's safe to be a vegan. It's also safe to be a vegan athlete. I do know, especially in working with teens over the years, a lot of the safety concerns or questions tend to come from parents. And I do just want to reassure anyone listening that is, it's absolutely safe and likely even health benefiting to eat a vegetarian diet.
Well, today we're going to dive into how we do that well and how you can not only be safe but thrive as a vegetarian. And we've got the perfect expert here joined with us to do this. What do you think, as plant-based juniors, this is your passion, what makes this nutrition space special?
Yeah, I think especially when we're talking to people about adapting a vegetarian diet, a lot of times people tend to think about nutrition in sort of these silos. We talk about macronutrients a lot, like protein, carbs, fat. And the cool thing about plant foods is that they're usually blends of two or sometimes three. And that can make vegetarian nutrition maybe feel a little bit tricky or confusing. For instance, like beans. Well, beans contain protein and they also contain carbohydrates. Whole grains, we tend to think of a carbohydrate source, but they also contain protein. A cup of pasta contains 8 grams of protein, which would be more than an egg. Nuts, seeds, these contain protein, but they also contain a lot of fat. And so I think sometimes when we're so used to sort of thinking about, like chicken as a protein source, it can be kind of confusing then when we look at the plate and try to figure out where some of these vegetarian foods fit in.
Okay, now hold on. You got a lot of people's attention there. Tell me again about that pasta.
Yeah. Again, we don't tend to always think about grains, especially whole grains, as protein rich sources, but they can be. Like I said, a cup of pasta has 7 to 8 grams of protein. And that's just regular pasta. I'm not talking about chickpea or legume-based pasta. Oatmeal, contains protein. I believe it's like 6 grams per serving. Bread, especially whole grain bread, can contain, 2 to 3 grams per slice. So, again, I think that sometimes we're so used to just thinking about foods of these like single macronutrients. And the cool thing about plants is that they are blends.
I love that. Okay, so now these athletes, we talk on our podcast a lot about the sports performance plate. how can a vegetarian use the sports performance plate, or will it differ somewhat for them?
Yeah, absolutely. You can use sports performance plates. And I love these. When I used to counsel, especially athletes, I would use these often. Really, the only category that's going to look different is going to be sort of that, lean protein, recovery, muscle building category, just because we are now getting into some specifics about where the protein sources can come from. As I said before, grains can help to fill some of that, but especially when we're talking about really rich sources of protein in the plant-based food categories. So tofu, tempeh, seitan, meat alternatives, vegetarian, could be Greek yogurt, eggs. There's a lot of different options. We're really just removing sort of the muscle-based protein options like chicken, beef, pork, etc.
I love how
and everything else stays the same. So,
Yeah. I love that perspective on it. And just to bring back, your Plant-Based Juniors has so many great recipe ideas for, especially, some of these athletes listening are lucky enough to grow up in a vegetarian home and have learned how to cook all of this growing up with whatever their home foods may be. But for those who are just curious and wanting to start or interested, your resource is one that I hope they will check out, because you have a lot of really, really fabulous content and great recipe ideas that these teenagers could do themselves.
Oh, thank you. And the one thing I would challenge, especially if this is a parent listening, I say this because I've had a lot of practice working with families, especially with parents, when a child comes to them and says, "Hey, I want to be vegetarian," and it's like, "Well, I don't know what to do." And I would say, I think this is a really beautiful opportunity to have this cool experience with your child. Go out together and maybe try some recipes or try some dishes at a plant-based restaurant. Buy tofu, buy cookbooks, go online and try to find some resources that look good to both of you, and sort of have this really kind of fun bonding experience. It doesn't have to be overwhelming, it doesn't have to be scary. And I think there's, especially when it comes to teenagers and trying to sort of connect with them, I think that letting your teenager know, "Hey, I see you, I hear you, I want to help you," and sort of working together, it can be a really enjoyable sort of a way to take on this dietary preference.
Yeah. And on the flip side, any teenagers who are listening, if you are getting some resistance from your parents, maybe don't come at it as like, "I'm cutting all this stuff out." Come at it as, "Hey, Mom, I wanted to try this out. I went and got some tofu at the store. I found this recipe. Will you help me?"
Absolutely.
I think you can begin to create those experiences with your parents too, and they'll probably be thrilled with that opportunity.
Totally. I mean, I remember I started being excited about eating vegetarian in high school. And I remember I went out and my mom bought like a block of tofu.
Uh-huh.
And I think it sat in the fridge until it expired, because we both were like, "I don't know. What do you think? I don't know." And then we bought a block of tofu again, and the same thing happened. And I think finally, after like 4 times of buying it, we both were like brave enough, like, the 90s too. And, it really became this thing. And, hold on, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
No, you're good. Just take a second and we can cut this little part. I'm going to take a drink too.
Sorry, I knew this tickle was coming and I was like, I can't stop it.
No, it's always when you're like saying something good too. It's like, wait, why now?
Okay, I can start over. I'm sorry. I think I don't know where I was going, so I will just start that little quick example over.
Sure.
If that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I started to dabble in vegetarianism when I was in high school. And I remember going to the store with my mom, and we bought a block of tofu, brought it home. We really didn't know what to do with it. And it sat in the fridge until it expired. We went back to the store, got another one. Same thing happened. I mean, I think it took like 3 or 4 times of buying tofu before we were even brave enough to open the package. So I do have a lot of empathy when it comes to both parents and teens and trying to sort of figure out what this looks like. I talk about tofu, tempeh, seitan as like, yeah, it's like chicken, because they're just so familiar to me, and I've been cooking them and preparing them for so long. I do understand and recognize that these can be really new and scary foods for a lot of people. Thankfully, it's 2025 and not, 1995. And there are so many resources out there that you can use to sort of figure out how exactly you want to cook these foods if they are new to you.
Absolutely. So can you touch on What are some of the key nutrients for vegetarians?
Yeah, the big one I think that comes to mind for a lot of people is iron, just because, as we're growing muscles, as we're expanding lean body mass, red blood cells, iron is so important, especially when it comes to female athletes who have started their period. Iron tends to be something that is another, sort of concern, vegetarian or not. Ironically, or I shouldn't say ironically, but to the surprise of many people, vegetarians actually and vegans tend to get higher amounts of iron than omnivores, just because plant-based foods are such rich sources of iron. The problem is when it comes to bioavailability, or that's just a fancy way of saying absorption. So the few things that we can do to help with that is, one, choose iron-rich foods often. Again, like I said, the good news is that iron is in a lot of plant foods. So things like beans, lentils, whole grains. Fortified cereals are a really great, convenient, economical option. Depending on the brand, they have anywhere from 9 to 11 milligrams of iron in them. So I'm a big fan of those, especially for like a breakfast option or a snack option. And then pairing iron with vitamin C, that is going to help with absorption. Other nutrients that I would tell vegetarians and anyone sort of on a plant-based diet to focus on would be B12. B12 is only reliably found in animal-based foods. And the tricky thing about B12 is that the way that we absorb it, we really need like small doses throughout the day. Not a problem if you're an omnivore, because you're likely going to be eating small doses of animal foods throughout the day. It does become a problem when we're relying on B12 in a single dose, like a supplement. And because of that, we need much higher levels in a single dose than we would if we were eating it throughout the day. And that's why when it comes to B12, you see higher amounts in supplements. That's just sort of my fancy way of saying I don't think a multivitamin with B12 is enough for most vegetarians. It's definitely not enough for most vegans or for vegans. And in those instances, I would recommend a single B12 supplement just to ensure that you're getting enough.
Well, that's really interesting. And probably some of these really intense, high-performing athletes, that could be really critical because their needs can be just so high for all nutrients.
Yeah. And, supplements, first of all, I don't think most people need supplements, even athletes, or a lot of them, I should say. There are certain specific ones that I do think are helpful, especially when it comes to anyone eating a plant-based diet, and I would put vegetarian in that umbrella. We do have a free supplement guide on our website at plantbaseddinners.com. It's very comprehensive. We tried to sort of make it as easy to sort of break down some of this nuance as possible and sort of help people say, okay, if you're eating this is what we would consider. Here's some sort of dosing things. So anyone is welcome to grab that if they want a little bit more detail.
That's great. And I'll link that below for the listeners. And we always mention on our podcast, anytime we're mentioning a supplement, to make sure that that supplement is third-party tested. And I'm sure you would agree with that.
Yes. Yeah, and in that guide, we do sort of have like what to look for and how to choose supplements. And it's not branded. It's really just trying to help people, because I do believe that supplementation is part of a well-planned vegetarian and vegan diet, and trying to take any sort of confusion out of that, I think, is really helpful.
Absolutely. Are there any other major nutrients that vegetarians or plant-based eaters, vegans, should be more aware of?
Yeah, I would say B12 is the big one, just because, again, it's only reliably found in animal foods. Iron is important for all athletes, or all children, all adults too, but especially for vegetarian athletes, just to ensure adequate intake there. The cool thing about if you're focusing on iron, you're probably also going to ensure adequate intake of zinc, which would be another nutrient, just because a lot of times where iron is found, so is zinc. So I sort of say to my clients, focus on iron, and zinc usually takes care of itself. Calcium is important for all teenagers, all kids especially. We do need a lot of calcium. This is sort of our bone building years. The good thing about vegetarians, they actually tend to get much more calcium, slightly higher calcium levels than omnivores, just because a lot of times they do tend to eat higher intakes of dairy. So calcium is actually a nutrient that I don't tend to be worried about when it comes to vegetarians. When it comes to vegans, that is a nutrient that I would want to sort of put a little bit more special focus on. And one of my favorite sources for that is just a fortified plant-based milk. It usually has the same amount of calcium as a dairy milk, sometimes a little bit higher depending on the brand and the bio. And then lastly, omega-3 fatty acids. So these can be found in things like nuts, seeds like walnuts, hemp seeds, chia seeds, then also in fatty fish. I don't recommend routine supplementation just because you're not consuming fatty fish, but some teens I know like to, some adults do as well. I sort of come down to the fact that it tends to be a little bit more of an expensive supplement. And, some people do find a benefit, especially when it comes to recovery. So if you want to take it, that's fine, but it's not a supplement that I would recommend as sort of a universal recommendation for everyone just because of that cost.
I feel like you made all of that sound really easy.
Good. That's my goal. A lot of
Yeah,
times I get the feedback that's like, oh, wow, that's so much. And I'm glad to hear that it doesn't sound too.
I'm really hearing like, pay attention to iron, take a B12 supplement, and drink either milk or a milk alternative.
Yeah. Really, I do think that we tend to hear the words, vegetarian, and it can feel like all these things are going to be missing, and the reality is it's really not. And there is a difference between vegan and vegetarian just when it comes to certain nutrients. But really, when we look at nutrient profiles of vegetarians and omnivores and intake levels, they actually tend to be fairly similar in micronutrients.
Yeah, I love that. So let's take this to the practical level. What are some of your pre-practice snack recommendations for vegetarians?
Yeah, so like any athlete, right, we really want to focus on carbohydrates to help fuel our body. I would say, the big thing is trying to find options that don't contain a lot of fiber, just because that can sort of cause some GI issues for some individuals. So my favorite options are banana with a little bit of peanut butter, maybe a little bit of honey. DIY trail mix, that's a really great one you can kind of take with you and have a handful of before practice, especially if practice is after school. So think like raisins, maybe pretzels, chocolate chips, a bowl of cereal. Again, you can have that dry if you want. If you want to add a little bit of milk, that helps too. Fruit, dried fruit. My athletes used to love like rice cakes with a tiny little bit of peanut butter, just because rice cakes are really easy to digest and they tend to give a lot of energy quickly. I also used to make athletes my like little rice balls. So like cooking and cooling rice, shaping them into balls. You can pack those with you, maybe a little bit of tofu if you have a little bit more time before your workout. But really, I would just say we want to focus on carbohydrates, especially the closer we get to exercise. If you've got a little bit more time, then you can add a little bit more protein, fat, and fiber.
So very similar to our non-vegetarian athletes as well.
Exactly. It's really the same principle. Again, the only thing that's going to be different is, those instances, or perhaps maybe you would grab like a slice of turkey or another kind of animal-based protein. Maybe you're going to switch that out for a dairy protein source, an egg, or a vegan protein source.
And I feel like a lot of this comes down to ideas, having enough ideas to keep your diet interesting, which again is where I feel like your resource is so valuable. What about when we talk about post-workout or recovery meals? What's important for our vegetarians to remember in their post-workout meal?
Yeah, so needs are going to be the same when it comes to post-workout recovery, just like it would be in anyone else. We're going to want to focus again on carbohydrate, right? So we need to do that to replenish our glycogen stores, to help protect our muscle. And then again, we want to also focus on protein. So, I would say all of those options I just said before, adding in a protein source, other easy, sort of teen-friendly options, if you will, maybe like a whole grain bagel. You can top that with peanut butter. You can top that with hummus. A smoothie. I'm a big fan of smoothies. One, because they're a great way to pack in nutrition. And especially if I've got any athletes who are having a tough time gaining weight or adding weight, smoothies are a really nice way. You can add chia seeds, hemp seeds, peanut butter, frozen fruit. I've been known to make some really great calorie bomb smoothies for my athletes, just to sort of help with not wanting necessarily to eat a huge meal after a workout, but also wanting to get that nutrition in. Smoothies can be a really good option. Yogurt is a fantastic sort of post-workout food because it's got that carbohydrate content and it's got protein. And you can even, choose if you wanted to, maybe like a Greek yogurt, which is going to have a little bit more protein in it, and then add in some fruit, maybe some honey to get that, carbohydrate content up. Sandwiches are fantastic, especially if you're having, a workout away from home and want to be able to pack something to eat after practice. I love trail mix. I love sandwiches. I love, sort of dry cereal. These are all things that are easy to throw into a bag. And then you can eat throughout the day depending on your schedule.
So maybe this is the wrong question, but do hydration needs differ for vegetarian athletes?
My one plug, I would say, for any athlete is there is no easier, there is no more effective, there is no more economical way to really help your performance than to be well hydrated. I do not think that we give hydration enough of a focus, especially when it comes to sports nutrition. And I would say, I think this is sort of where it really can help you feel better. There's no different needs when it comes to vegetarians versus omnivores. It's just my plug to say that I think hydration doesn't get the focus it deserves, and it really can make a difference when it comes to performance, to being well hydrated.
I love that. Yeah, the most economical for sure.
Most and we don't tend to think about it, right?
Yeah.
So much of the time we're focusing on like, oh, I need to make sure to have my snack or my meal after, and we really forget about, well, one, during performance hydration, but then also just staying hydrated throughout the day.
Yeah, that's great. And I think you've just hammered home this, the needs of a vegetarian athlete are no different. It's just the route you're getting the nutrition is slightly different.
Yeah, and really, I hope that's the takeaway. I really want to emphasize that there really is no, unnecessary concern or anything truly that different. All we're doing is taking the section of the plate that we tend to think about certain protein sources and switching it up for different ones. That's it. Everything else stays the same.
What do you think is the most common myth people believe about vegetarians?
When I was in school to become a dietitian, there was still this big focus on combining protein sources. So, for a while, we believed that we had to have a grain, and then we also had to have, let's say, a legume, and pairing those together would give us a quote unquote complete protein. And I remember being in undergrad when I was dabbling in vegetarianism and sort of writing down my foods throughout the day to make sure I was pairing them. And there's no need to do that anymore. We now understand a little bit more about how amino acids work in the body. And really, as long as you are eating a variety of protein needs and foods, as long as you are eating enough calories, you do not have to worry at all about combining different sources of plant-based proteins.
Very interesting. So the idea being that there was a focus on this, you have to have the complete combination, and now it's more of a focus on you just have to get enough overall.
Yeah. There is some thought, and I would agree with this, that vegetarians likely need a little bit more protein, but it's not much. And the reality is too, we talk a lot about protein, but most people, even athletes, are getting enough. As long as calorie needs are met, it is rare that protein needs would not be met. There does, tend to be concern and issue when calories are being cut. Then we do want to, have more of a focus on making sure other nutrient needs are met. But really, as long as calories are met, protein needs are met. And also, I would say, there's also this myth, I think, that's still out there that plant-based foods, let's say, are either an incomplete or a complete protein. And all plant foods contain all amino acids, essential amino acids. They just contain smaller amounts. So you do have to ensure, like, let's say, for instance, you were going to only eat broccoli. I don't know why you would, but let's say all you wanted to do is eat broccoli throughout the day. Well, yeah, you would see some amino acid deficiencies because you're not having a variety there, but no one eats like that. So it's sort of one of these myths that I think tends to be talked about a lot, but it's just not really a practical thing because we all eat a varied diet. And again, like I said, as long as you're eating enough calories and the protein sort of combinations take care of themselves.
That's such a great point. Now, some vegetarian diets can be much higher in fiber than non-vegetarian diets, which is overall a fantastic thing. But should athletes be careful about how much fiber they're eating before an intense workout?
Yeah, this is really where that fiber focus, and I would say this is true for everyone, but again, especially because only plant foods contain fiber, this is really where timing is going to be helpful. And this is also where refined carbohydrates can be our friend. I think a lot of times we hear about the benefits of whole grains, and whole grains are great, but perhaps maybe not before a workout, especially close to a workout. Do we need to be having, 3, 4, 6, 8 grams of fiber? Because that can cause some gastric issues. So this is where things like those rice cakes I mentioned are really sort of low fiber, easy to digest. This is where things like white bread, rice would be a good option over maybe their more whole grain counterparts. And also having a smaller amount. I would say choosing like low fiber fruits. So this may not be the time to do berries, but maybe a banana would be okay. And it's really just before the workout. After the workout, you can load on the fiber. Throughout the day, you can enjoy it. But really it's sort of that 1 to 3 hour mark before the workout, depending on the person, is where I'd focus perhaps on sort of lowering down fiber, especially if there's a known history of issues.
Now, let's try to give our athletes some ideas here because you are full of really good ones. Let's go through some real life scenarios. Breakfast seems to be a meal that a lot of teenagers struggle with, regardless of athletic potential or vegetarian status. But what do you recommend for a great breakfast for our vegetarian athletes?
Yeah, I also like to plate the reminder out there that breakfast does not have to be breakfast food. I have two, I would say, Italian children, and their preferred breakfast food is pasta. So that, that's what they love to eat for breakfast, and that's fine. We tend to think that breakfast has to be this specific category, but it really doesn't. And so if that helps you feel like, oh yeah, I like a sandwich for breakfast, I can pack that, I can take it on the bus, or I can take it in the car on the way to school, like great. Doesn't have to necessarily be a quote unquote breakfast food. One of my favorite grab and go options is overnight oats, because you can make them ahead of time at night, and you can really make them as, delicious or as varied as you want to. So really you're just going to take a base of rolled oats. You can add in plant-based milk or dairy milk, any kind of toppings you want. So you can do dried fruit, fresh fruit, peanut butter, almond butter, nuts, seeds. You can put, cocoa powder in. My kids like to put in like Nutella. Great. You can sort of make these little jars ahead of time, pop them in the fridge. And it's also nice, especially if you don't have a lot of time in the morning, you can literally grab a jar and walk out the door. I'm a big fan of yogurt, especially vegetarian, sort of a nice, again, they can be as sort of nutritionally dense as you want them to be, depending on the variety. You can grab those. Dry cereal is a nice one to also, sort of keep in your book bag. If you're like, I'm not quite hungry in the morning, but I might be a little bit later. That's usually an easy one you can grab in between classes, bars. So I really think it's trying to figure out what are foods you like to eat, and then what can you do to make them easier to sort of have in that grab and go situation.
Those are great ideas. And I love that none of them require like a chef in the morning, because none of us are going to be doing that.
Or time, right? I mean, I feel like especially some schools, my gosh, I think my high school started at like 7:20, it was time to get up and make anything hot. No way.
No. Yeah, definitely not. Those are great ideas. Now, what about school lunch? Do you have any lunch tips to help them either packing a lunch or making choices for lunch to get all that they need?
Yeah, I think a lunch can be a really great way to sort of focus on, that performance plate, to really sort of check the boxes on certain categories. So if you're going to do the school lunch program, know that they offer vegetarian meals. It's going to depend on your school on sort of what that specific menu looks like, but you can always get a vegetarian option there. My kids are a little bit younger, but all of these ideas that I do for them will work for teenagers. So, like you can pack a lentil soup in a thermos. My kids love like black beans and rice that I'll make the night before and then warm up and pop that in a thermos. It's an easy one. Chickpea salad. It's sort of like a tuna salad, but it's chickpeas. And we have recipes for that on our website. There's lots of recipes out there to try it. It's delicious if you have not tried that yet, especially if you like tuna. I love edamame. There's certain brands you can buy frozen and then thaw in the fridge overnight. So you can literally just take the bag and go and pop them out. Those are going to be great sources of iron, fiber, protein. Hard-boiled eggs are nice, sort of pop into your lunchbox. String cheese is a good one. So I think it's really, again, trying to figure out, what kind of foods you like to eat at home, and then how can you make them into like a lunchbox friendly way. Meat alternatives, I don't know how you feel about them, but I have
no feelings.
Yeah, I have very little concerns about them. The only concern I have is the fact they tend to be high in sodium. And that varies on the brand, but especially when it comes to teens who especially are missing, if you're choosing a vegetarian diet because of ethics or because of, you sort of want the sort of similar taste of meat, but don't want to actually eat meat. I think these are fantastic products. There's been some really good studies that have come out. There's a swap meat trial at Stanford that showed that swapping in Beyond products for organic sort of animal-based products, the Beyond group tend to have better cardiometabolic outcomes. There was another review paper that came out showing similar things. So all that to say is, yes, they're a processed food, but I nutritionally don't have any concern with them. And I think they can be a really great way to add in calories, iron, protein, and these products tend to be pretty high in protein. So that can be a really sort of nice, convenient way for a lot of individuals who are sort of focused on protein to add them in. And not just sort of those sort of more processed meat alternatives, but also things like seitan, which is like the mock meat. That's another great product that tends to be really high in protein and fairly low fat. So that's another sort of nice option to add to the table.
That's a great point to make, because one of the things that athletes encounter more than other people, we talk on the podcast often that their needs are no different, except that their demand is really high. And it can be difficult sometimes to find options that are practical and realistic. And so it's important to take that perspective and have options that will work with everyone's schedule and promote health overall. So yeah. I love that. Now, if our athletes listening today can only take away one piece of nutrition advice from you, what do you hope that would be?
If you've made it this far, I would hope that whether you're a vegetarian or veg curious, that you realize that it's perhaps not complicated, that it doesn't have to be overwhelming. It can be delicious, and also to lean in and try. We sort of started the conversation talking about the fact that Plant-Based Juniors was really founded in this idea that we were looking at sort of the landscape of children's diets in America and realizing just how low they were in overall plants. I think 90% of kids don't get enough fruits and vegetables every day. 95% of all Americans don't meet fiber needs. Fiber, of course, is only found in plant foods. So really sort of shifting the plate and shifting, I think, our attitude around these kind of foods and really sort of saying, okay, where can I add more plants in? Even if it's not all the way, but there is such a benefit when it comes to, and especially for athletes, when we're talking about micronutrient intake, we're talking about, really the healthfulness of our diet when it comes to increasing performance. Plants offer so much nutrition and really give you a good sort of bang for your buck when it comes to micronutrients for macronutrients. So I would say to see where you can add more plants to your own plate.
I love it. And I ask all guests on my podcast to complete the following sentence. The best fueled athletes do what?
I would say the best fueled athletes focus on recovery as much as they do their performance.
I love that one. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. You have an incredible platform that these teenagers can learn from, their parents can learn from. Go check her out, Plant-Based Juniors. She also has resources. You have checklists. You have your supplement guide. They even have really cool swag if you want some of that. I would just love for all of you to reach out to her. And if you're more curious, you want to know more about some of these things, I would suggest going back and checking out the protein episode, which will dive a little deeper into protein itself and help you to look through some of those issues, and also to the sports performance plate, which will complement these ideas. Thank you so much again for joining me, Alexandra.
This is my time. I'm on the rise. Can't hold me down, I'm too fly. This is my time. Ready to shine.